The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls like a widow's lament, carrying with it the bite of December cold that settled deep in the bones. Annie Calder stood in the doorway of the old warehouse on the outskirts of Dustwell, her traveling case at her feet, watching the last light drain from the sky like water through cupped hands. She'd arrived on the afternoon stage, dust-covered and bone-weary, her dark hair pinned severely beneath a practical bonnet that had seen better days. The driver had looked at her askance when she'd asked about lodgings, jerking his thumb toward the respectable boarding house on Main Street. But respectability came at a price Annie could no longer afford. Not in coins, perhaps, but in the currency of pretense and propriety that had grown too heavy to carry. The warehouse keeper, a stooped man named Josiah Pratt, had shown her the room with obvious reluctance. "Used to store grain," he'd muttered, keys jangling like accusations in his gnarled hand. "Ain't proper for a lady." But Annie had seen the low rent in his roomy eyes, the empty months that stretched behind and ahead of this forgotten corner of his property. She'd pressed $2 silver into his palm, nearly all she had, and watched his protests crumble like old parchment. Now, alone in the gathering dark, she surveyed her new home. The room was perhaps 12 feet square, with rough plank floors that had known the weight of harvest seasons long past. A narrow cot hugged one wall, its thin mattress stuffed with what might have been straw or might have been hope worn thin. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the corner like a patient toad, its pipe reaching toward the ceiling in rusty supplication. Annie set down her case and removed her gloves with deliberate care, each finger freed like a small rebellion. She'd worn these same gloves to tea with Reverend Morrison just 3 weeks past, when he'd sat across from her in his tidy parlor and explained why he could not, in good conscience, take her as his wife. "You read too much, Miss Calder," he'd said, his voice gentle as a closing door. "Greek philosophy, political treatises, why, Mrs. Henderson saw you with a volume of scientific papers just last week. A wife should be a helpmate, not a competitor." She'd wanted to laugh at the memory of his face when she'd asked if he'd actually read Aristotle's views on women, or if he simply preferred his philosophy served second-hand. Instead, she'd risen, straightened her skirts, and walked out of his life with her spine straight as a rifle barrel. The match flared between her fingers, casting dancing shadows across the bare walls. She lit the oil lamp she'd found on a crooked shelf, its amber glow pushing back the darkness but not the chill. The stove would need kindling, coal if she could afford it. For tonight, she'd make do with the 2 wool blankets folded at the foot of the cot and the heat of her own stubborn will. She just unpinned her hair, letting it fall in dark waves past her shoulders. When the knock came, 3 measured raps, neither timid nor demanding, spaced like heartbeats in the quiet. Annie froze, hairpin still clutched in her palm. Visitors after dark in a place like this meant trouble, or worse. She moved to the door, one hand reaching for the iron poker that leaned against the stove. "Who's there?" "Someone who should warn you." The voice was deep, roughened by weather or whiskey, or both. Annie's fingers tightened on the poker. "Warn me of what?" "Open the door, ma'am. The wind's got teeth tonight." Against every shred of sense her mother had ever tried to instill in her, Annie lifted the latch. The man who filled her doorway looked like winter itself had taken human form. Snow clung to his dark beard, and his long duster coat bore the dust of 100 roads. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his features, but she caught the glint of gray eyes that seemed to hold storms. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Micah Hale. Folks call me the Drifter, though I answer to either." "Annie Calder," she replied, not moving aside. "You said you had a warning." His eyes swept the room behind her, taking in the barren space, the single lamp, the feminine traveling case so out of place in this forgotten corner. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of recognition. "This place," he said slowly, "has a way of holding on to people. Josiah didn't tell you, did he? About the others who've rented this room. Mr. Pratt was quite eager to discuss the rate, Annie said dryly. Less so about the history. A smile ghosted across the stranger's weathered features. 5 years back, a traveling merchant took this room for a night, ended up staying through spring, then summer, opened a shop on Main Street. Year after that, a school teacher from back east. She's still here, married Josiah's nephew. Then there was the artist, the surveyor, the woman who came through selling tonics. And they all stayed. Annie finished. How unfortunate for them. Unfortunate. The drifter studied her with those storm-gray eyes. Maybe not. But I thought you should know. If you sleep here, you'll never leave. The wind chose that moment to shriek through the eaves, sending snow swirling between them like scattered promises. Annie shivered, though not entirely from cold. Is that a curse or a blessing, Mr. Hale? He was quiet long enough that she wondered if he'd answer at all. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Depends on what you're running from, Miss Calder, and what you're running to. She felt the truth of her situation settle around her shoulders like a familiar shawl, running from a life of measured words and smaller dreams, of being too much and never enough. Running to she didn't know yet, but perhaps that was its own kind of answer. Would you like to come in? The words surprised her even as she spoke them. I have no coffee to offer, no proper chairs. But you're right about the wind. He hesitated, and she saw something flicker across his face, surprise, perhaps, or a wariness that spoke of too many doors closed in his face. Then he swept off his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with premature silver, and stepped across her threshold. The room seemed smaller with him in it, but not uncomfortably so. He moved with the careful grace of a man who'd learned to navigate hostile spaces, setting his hat on the crooked shelf and shrugging out of his snow-dusted coat. You're new to Dustwell, he said, not a question. This afternoon. Annie closed the door against the wind, aware suddenly of her unbound hair, the impropriety of entertaining a strange man after dark. But propriety had led her to Reverend Morrison's parlor, to his careful rejection. Perhaps impropriety might lead somewhere better. And you, she asked, are you one of those the warehouse claimed? No, ma'am, I come and go as the work allows. Sleep rough, mostly. Or in Harlan's barn when he's feeling charitable and I've got coin for the privilege. Then how do you know about this place's peculiarity? He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. Because I've warned every soul who's taken this room for the past 5 years. Started with the schoolteacher, kept on because, he shrugged, because someone should know what they're choosing. Annie moved to her traveling case, withdrawing a carefully wrapped bundle. I have bread, she said, and a bit of cheese. It's not much, but... It's kindness, he finished quietly. That's always much. They sat on the floor near the cold stove, sharing the simple meal while snow whispered secrets against the walls. He told her about Dustwell, the respectable families on Main Street, the saloon that served watered whiskey and gossip in equal measure, the churchyard where judgment grew as thick as prairie grass. And they tolerate you? Annie asked. A drifter who warns strangers about cursed rooms. Tolerate's a strong word, but I'm useful when there's heavy work needs doing, and I keep my presence limited. She heard what he didn't say. Recognized the careful boundaries of a life lived on sufferance. It was a dance she knew, though her steps had been different smiling at tea parties while her mind wandered to books hidden beneath her bed, agreeing demurely while her thoughts roared with unspoken arguments. I was to be married, she found herself saying, to a reverend who thought my mind was a defect to be corrected rather than what it is. And what is it? She met his storm-gray eyes. Hungry? The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. This town, he said finally. It's small and mean in some ways. People here like their world ordered, predictable. But there are cracks, places where different kinds of lives can take root. This warehouse is one of them. Because it's cursed. Because it's forgotten. Josiah takes the rent and asks no questions. The respectable folk pretend it doesn't exist. And those who find themselves here, he gestured at the bare walls, they make what they need. Annie looked around the stark room, seeing it differently now. Not a place of exile, but of possibility. Not an ending, but perhaps a beginning. "Thank you," she said, "for the warning." He rose, reaching for his coat. "Will you stay?" She thought of the stage that would depart tomorrow, of cities where she knew no one and would have to start again anyway. Thought of Reverend Morrison's careful kindness that cut deeper than cruelty. Thought of this strange man who'd knocked on her door in a snowstorm to offer truth to a stranger. "I haven't decided," she said. He settled his hat on his head, touched the brim once more. "If you do," he said. "Harlan's got work at the livery, tells everyone he won't hire women, but his wife keeps the books and she's got more sense than him. Mention you know your figures, and she'll find something." Then he was gone, leaving only the echo of his boots on the stairs and snow melting in small puddles by the door. Annie stood in the lamplight, hairpins still clutched in one hand, feeling as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. She moved to the window, watched his tall figure disappear into the swirling snow. The drifter, who came to warn strangers about rooms that wouldn't let them leave. Who spoke of cracks where different lives could grow. "If you sleep here, you'll never leave." Annie Calder smiled, a small, secret smile that would have horrified Reverend Morrison. She spread one blanket on the narrow cot, wrapped the other around her shoulders, and prepared to sleep in a place that might never let her go. Perhaps, she thought as the wind sang its lonely song, that was exactly what she'd been looking for all along. The morning came wrapped in frost and silence, painting the warehouse windows with delicate ferments of ice. Annie woke to find her breath visible in the cold air. Her body curled tight beneath both blankets. The stove sat cold and patient, waiting for fuel she didn't have. She dressed quickly, fingers stiff with cold, and ventured out into Dustwell's reluctant dawn. The town looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, its pretensions laid bare like bones. Main Street stretched before her, lined with storefronts that wore their respectability like Sunday clothes. At Murphy's General Store, she purchased the bare essentials: a small sack of coal, lamp oil, a few tins of beans, hardtack biscuit that would last. Mrs. Murphy, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper tongue, counted Annie's coins twice before surrendering the goods. "You're the one took Josiah's warehouse room," she said, not a question. "I am." Mrs. Murphy's gaze traveled from Annie's worn boots to her carefully mended gloves. "We'll see." Annie carried her purchases back through streets already filling with whispers. She felt the weight of watching eyes, heard the rustle of skirts drawn aside as proper women gave her wide berth. By the time she reached the warehouse, her cheeks burned with more than cold. The drifter sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood with slow, deliberate strokes. He looked up at her approach, gray eyes taking in her laden arms and rigid spine. "Morning, Miss Calder." "Mr. Hale." She paused, parcels growing heavy. "I thought you didn't linger in town." "Had business at the lumber mill. Thought I'd see if you'd stayed." "As you see." He rose, pocketing his knife, and without asking took the sack of coal from her arms. She wanted to protest she'd carried her own burdens this far, but something in his manner stopped her. This wasn't charity or condescension. It was simply what people did, people who understood the weight of pride and the price of kindness. Inside, he helped her get the stove going, showing her the damper's tricks, where to heap the coal for the longest burn. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the cold that had settled into the room's corners like an unwelcome guest. "Coffee?" Annie asked, producing a small pot she'd bought with her last coins. He hesitated, and she saw him calculate the impropriety, the talk it would cause if anyone saw him leave. Then he nodded. Obliged. They sat on crates he'd found somewhere, the coffee bitter and thin but hot enough to matter. In the growing light from the window, she could see him better. The lines carved deep by sun and wind, the careful way he held himself, as if ready to move quickly. His hands, she noticed, were scarred but steady, the hands of a man who'd worked with both tools and weapons. You were a soldier, she said. His cup stilled halfway to his lips. Was the way you move. My father had the same carefulness after he came home from the war. Which side? Pennsylvania 15th. You, Texas 3rd. He watched her, waiting for the reaction that usually came with that admission in a town this far north. Annie sipped her coffee. That's done now. Not for everyone. No, she agreed. But I've found that men who actually fought are usually the ones most willing to let it be done. Something eased in his shoulders. He set down his cup, rolled up his sleeve to reveal a long scar that ran from elbow to wrist. Sharpsburg. Took grape shot clearing a fence line. Field hospital wanted to take the arm, but a colored nurse named Sarah. He shook his head. She saved it. Saved me. Never did learn her last name. And after, drifted. Worked ships out of Galveston for a time. Railroad camps. Anywhere that needed a strong back and didn't ask questions. His voice carried no self-pity, just fact laid bare as winter ground. Had a wife once, Mary Catherine. Fever took her while I was laying track in Kansas. By the time I got word, she was 3 months in the ground. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Annie understood the shape of loss, how it carved spaces in a life that nothing quite filled. I was supposed to be married this spring, she offered, to a man who loved the idea of me more than the reality. He wanted a wife who would pour tea and agree with his sermons. I wanted... She gestured helplessly at the bare room. Not this, exactly, but not that either. What did you want? To matter, to think my own thoughts without apology, to read what I chose and speak what I believed. She laughed, but it came out cracked. Modest ambitions for a woman, apparently. In my experience, Micah said slowly, the people who tell you your ambitions are too large are usually the ones whose own have grown too small. They were still sitting there, coffee growing cold between them, when footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Harlan Pike from the livery, red-faced and breathing hard. Drifter need you at. He stopped short, taking in the domestic scene. His eyes narrowed. What's this then? Micah rose unhurriedly. Miss Calder, Mr. Pike, Harlan, Miss Calder. I know who she is. Pike snapped. Whole town's talking about the uppity woman who took the warehouse room. And here you are, bold as brass. Having coffee. Annie interrupted, standing, which I offered after Mr. Hale helped with my stove, unless hospitality has been outlawed in Dustwell. Pike's face darkened further, but Micah stepped between them. You said you needed me. Bentley's mare got tangled in wire. Need someone who won't spook her worse while we cut her free. Micah reached for his coat. I'll come. And you, Pike pointed a thick finger at Annie. You'd best learn quick how things work here. We're a God-fearing town. Won't stand for any what? Annie's voice could have cut glass. Any woman living alone, any person showing kindness to a neighbor, or perhaps you object to coffee before noon. Pike spluttered, but Micah was already guiding him toward the door. Over Pike's shoulder, the drifter gave Annie the smallest shake of his head. A warning. Choose your battles. When they were gone, Annie sank onto her crate, hands trembling slightly. She'd done it again, spoken when she should have stayed silent, challenged when she should have demurred. It was this terrible need in her to push back against the weight of others' expectations, even when wisdom counseled patience. The day stretched empty before her. She needed work, needed to establish herself before her meager funds ran out. Micah had mentioned Harlan's wife, but after that scene, the livery seemed impossible. Instead, she walked to the churchyard where a small school held lessons. The teacher, Miss Thornberry, surely the one Micah had mentioned. The one who'd stayed was a bird-like woman with intelligent eyes behind wire spectacles. "I heard you were educated," Miss Thornberry said when Annie introduced herself. "Back east. Philadelphia. My father believed in education for women." Progressive. The word held neither approval nor censure, just acknowledgement. "I could use help with the older students' arithmetic. The town pays little, but—" "I'd be grateful," Annie said quickly. "Tomorrow, then, 7 sharp, and Miss Calder." The teacher's eyes held a knowing look. "Dustwell can be challenging for women who don't fit the expected pattern, but there are more of us than you might think." Walking back, Annie noticed a familiar figure near the warehouse. Micah sat on the bottom step again, a bloody rag wrapped around his left hand. "The mare?" "She's fine. I'm fine," he added. Seeing her expression, "Just a scratch from the wire." But when Annie looked closer, she could see the gash was deep, still seeping blood through the makeshift bandage. Without asking permission, she took his hand in hers, unwrapping the dirty cloth. "This needs proper cleaning," she said. "I've had worse." "That's not the point." She led him upstairs, ignoring the impropriety of it. At least Pike wasn't around to see. Inside, she heated water on the now warm stove, found clean cloth in her trunk. Micah submitted to her ministrations with a kind of bemused patience. "You've done this before," he observed as she cleaned the wound with a gentle efficiency. "My mother was a midwife. She believed in teaching her daughters useful skills." Annie wrapped fresh bandage around his hand, tying it off neatly. "There. Try not to tear it open again immediately." "Yes, ma'am." That ghost of a smile played at his lips. "You got on at the school. How did you never mind? This town has more eyes than windows. Miss Thornberry's good people. Fair. She'll watch your back if you watch hers." "And who watches yours?" The question hung between them. Micah flexed his bandaged hand carefully, then stood. "I manage," he said quietly. "Always have." But something in his eyes suggested that managing and living might be two different things entirely. Annie wanted to press, to ask why he stayed near a town that barely tolerated him, why he spent his time warning strangers about warehouse rooms. Instead, she walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said, "for this morning, for yesterday." He touched his hat brim, that gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of acknowledging things too complex for words. Then he was gone again, leaving her alone with the warmth of the stove and the echo of shared silence. That night, as snow began to fall again, Annie made soup from beans and a bit of salt pork. She had enough coal for several days now, enough food to last the week. Tomorrow she'd begin teaching, earning her place in this strange town one arithmetic lesson at a time. As she prepared for bed, she thought of Micah's scarred hands and storm-gray eyes, of the careful way he moved through a world that had no real place for him. She thought of Mary Catherine, 3 months buried before her husband even knew to grieve, of all the ways people could be alone, and the small graces that made loneliness bearable. The wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. But the warehouse room was warm now, the stove glowing like a steady heart. Annie pulled the blankets up to her chin and closed her eyes, no longer minding if the room decided to keep her. She was beginning to understand that some prisons were just homes that hadn't been recognized yet, and some drifters, perhaps, were just looking for a reason to stop drifting. "If you sleep here, you'll never leave." Maybe, Annie thought as sleep claimed her. That was less warning than promise, less curse than invitation to finally stay. A week passed in the rhythm of small victories and smaller defeats. Annie's mornings belonged to the schoolhouse, where she discovered that teaching arithmetic to ranch children was like trying to herd cats with numbers. But Miss Thornberry proved a steady ally. And slowly the children warmed to Annie's patient explanations and her refusal to shame them for mistakes. The afternoons, however, belonged to the town's judgment. It started with small things. Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile suddenly had no thread in the color Annie requested. The butcher discovered his best cuts were already spoken for whenever she approached his counter. Women crossed the street rather than share the wooden sidewalk with her. Annie bore it all with her chin high and her thoughts carefully locked away. She'd known this would come the price of living alone, of refusing to apologize for her education, of being seen talking to the town's drifter. In a place like Dustwell, reputation was currency, and hers was already overdrawn. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected respite. Annie had noticed young Mrs. Clayton, the widow who lived in the house nearest the warehouse, struggling with her sewing. The woman's daughter, barely 5, played with scraps on their front step while her mother wrestled with fabric that refused to cooperate. "Pardon me," Annie called from the street. "Might I help?" "Mrs. Clayton Ruth," she insisted, looked up with tired eyes. "Unless you can make this blessed fabric behave, I don't see how—" But Annie could. Her mother had insisted all her daughters learn needlework, though Annie had preferred books to embroidery hoops. Still, the skills remained, and soon she was showing Ruth how to ease the fabric around the curved seam, how to make the stubborn wool lie flat. "You're a wonder," Ruth breathed as the dress began to take proper shape. "I've been fighting this for days. It's for Mrs. Pike. She commissioned it for the church social, and if I don't finish—" "You'll finish," Annie said firmly. "Bring it by my room this evening. We'll work on it together." Ruth's face transformed with relief, then clouded. "But won't people talk you being—" She gestured vaguely. "Being what helpful?" Annie smiled. "Let them talk. Their words won't finish this dress." That evening, Ruth appeared at Annie's door with her daughter Emma in the troublesome dress. They worked by lamplight, Annie guiding Ruth's hands through the difficult passages while Emma played quietly with Annie's empty thread spools. "I heard you were educated," Ruth said carefully, eyes on her stitching. "That you read books, real books." "Guilty as charged." "Could you?" Ruth's voice dropped. "Could you teach me just a little? I can read some, but not well. And Emma, I want better for her than—" She gestured at her own worn hands. The widow's weeds she wore like armor against the world. "Of course," Annie said softly. "Whenever you like." They were still working when footsteps echoed on the stairs. Annie tensed. Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. But it was Micah's voice that called through the door. "Miss Calder, I've got wood for your stove." Annie opened the door to find him with an armload of split logs, snow dusting his shoulders. His eyes took in the domestic scene. Ruth bent over her sewing, Emma building a tower of spools, and something softened in his expression. "Mrs. Clayton," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Hale." Ruth's voice was carefully neutral, but Annie caught the quick glance between them, the kind that spoke of shared history. Micah stacked the wood by the stove without comment. Annie noticed his bandage was clean, the wound healing well. When he straightened, Emma had abandoned her spools to stare at him with the frank curiosity of children. "You're the man who saved Mr. Bentley's horse," she announced. "Just helped a little," Micah said gravely. "Mama says you're a hero, but Mrs. Pike says you're a—" "Emma," Ruth flushed scarlet. "That's enough." An awkward silence fell. Micah's face had gone carefully blank, the way Annie had seen men look when bracing for a blow. She felt anger rise in her throat like bile. "Mr. Hale is kind," Annie said firmly, meeting Emma's eyes. "He helps people who need it and asks nothing in return. That's worth more than all of Mrs. Pike's opinions put together. Emma nodded solemnly, as if filing this away. Micah looked at Annie with an expression she couldn't quite read: surprise, perhaps, or something more complicated. "I should go," he said quietly. "Stay for coffee," Annie heard herself say. "Ruth was just telling me about the church social. Perhaps you could advise us on whether Mrs. Pike prefers her dresses to sermonize as loudly as she does." Ruth made a sound that might have been a laugh caught behind her hand. Micah's lips twitched. "Can't say about the dress," he said, settling onto a crate. "But I'd wager it'll be righteous regardless." They spent an hour in surprisingly easy companionship. Ruth relaxed enough to smile, even laugh when Annie told the story of her first attempt at teaching young Bobby Daniels to multiply, which had ended with him declaring numbers were devil's work and hiding under his desk. When Ruth finally gathered Emma and the now completed dress to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the help. For—" She glanced at Micah, then back to Annie. "For treating us like people." After they left, Annie and Micah sat in comfortable silence. The stove crackled, warm and steady. Outside, snow fell soft as whispers. "Ruth's husband died last year," Micah said eventually. "Mining accident. The town helped some at first, but charity wears thin when there's no man to eventually repay it. And do you help her?" "When I can, carefully. A widow taking help from someone like me," he shrugged, "would make things worse for her." Annie studied his profile in the lamplight. "Someone like you? You mean a drifter?" "Among other things." His voice was flat as old beer. "Texan, Confederate, man who can't settle. Take your pick of sins. I don't recall kindness being listed among the sins." "Depends on who's making the list." Annie rose, moved to the small trunk where she kept her few possessions. From it, she withdrew a slim volume, its leather binding worn soft with handling. "Whitman," she said, offering it to him. "Have you read him?" Micah took the book carefully, as if it might break. "Heard of him. Never had the chance." "Keep it for now. I think you might find him understanding." He turned the book over in his hands, thumb tracing the embossed title. "You'd trust me with this." "It's just a book, Mr. Hale." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." He left soon after, the book tucked inside his coat like a secret. Annie cleaned up the coffee cups and sewing scraps, thinking about the evening's strange arithmetic: a widow, a drifter, and a disgraced woman, finding warmth in a warehouse room. In Dustwell's moral accounting, they added up to nothing, but in the lamplight, with coffee and quiet laughter, they'd felt like something more. Saturday brought the first real test. Annie had ventured to Murphy's general store for supplies. She'd timed it carefully mid-morning when the store was less crowded, when she might complete her business without incident. But as she reached for a bolt of simple calico, another hand intercepted hers. Mrs. Pike stood there, formidable in bombazine and righteousness. Behind her clustered 3 other women, their faces set in identical expressions of disapproval. "That fabric is already spoken for," Mrs. Pike announced. Annie glanced at the bolt, one of a dozen identical ones. All of them. All of them. "In fact, I believe we've already claimed everything you might want in this store." Mrs. Pike's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Perhaps you should try elsewhere." "The next town is 30 miles, Annie said evenly. "How unfortunate." The other women tittered. Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "I see. And if I need goods, food basic necessities." "Perhaps," Mrs. Pike said, leaning closer. "You should have thought of that before setting yourself up in that warehouse, before entertaining men at all hours, before corrupting innocent women like poor Mrs. Clayton with your ideas." "My ideas." Teaching her to read, filling her head with notions. Mrs. Pike's voice dropped to a hiss. We know your type. Miss Calder. Too good for honest work. Too proud to know your place. Dustwell doesn't need another tragedy. That warehouse has seen enough. Something cold settled in Annie's stomach. What do you mean? But Mrs. Pike was already turning away, her coterie falling into step like trained dogs. At the counter, Mrs. Murphy wouldn't meet Annie's eyes. I'll need thread, Annie said quietly. Black and salt? Mrs. Murphy's hands shook slightly as she gathered the meager items. That'll be double the usual price. Annie counted out the coins without comment. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Murphy whispered. The old newspaper office. Mr. Chen runs a goods store from the back. He doesn't care about talk. Outside, Annie stood in the bitter wind, parcels clutched to her chest. Down the street, she could see the church spire piercing the gray sky like an accusation. Somewhere behind these storefronts and righteous faces, there were others like Ruth, like Micah, like herself, people who didn't fit the narrow mold Dustwell demanded. The old newspaper office sat on a neglected side street, its windows dusty with disuse. But around back, Annie found a small door marked simply Goods. Inside, an elderly Chinese man looked up from his ledger. Miss Calder, he said before she could introduce herself. I wondered when you'd find your way here. His store was small but well stocked, prices fair. As he wrapped her purchases in brown paper, Mr. Chen said quietly, this town has a short memory for some things, a long one for others. The trick is surviving until they decide which kind you are. Walking back to the warehouse, Annie passed the livery, through the wide doors. She glimpsed Micah working, his movements steady and sure as he gentled a nervous colt. He looked up as she passed, and for a moment their eyes met. He touched his hat brim. That gesture she was learning meant more than hello. It meant, I see you. It meant, you're not alone. That night, as she prepared for bed, Annie heard Ruth's voice through the thin walls, reading slowly but determinedly to Emma. The words were halting but full of hope. Let them watch, Annie thought. Let them whisper and point and close their doors. She had warm walls and work that mattered. She had Ruth's determination and Emma's trust. She had Micah's quiet presence and Mr. Chen's knowing nod. She had a book out in the world with a man who'd never owned one, and a woman next door learning that words could be keys to locked doors. The warehouse room had claimed her, just as the drifter warned. But maybe, Annie thought as sleep took her, being claimed wasn't the same as being trapped. Maybe it was just another word for finding where you belonged. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Tommy Morrison with all the ceremony of a summons. Annie recognized the pale blue paper before she even opened it, the same stationery Mrs. Pike used for all her social pronouncements. The Ladies' Auxiliary cordially requests your assistance with decorations for the winter social. Annie read aloud to the empty room. Your skills with needle and thread have been noted. She nearly laughed at the transparent trap. After weeks of being persona non grata in every respectable establishment, suddenly they needed her. But she understood the game. They'd heard about her work on Ruth's dress, about the widow's visits. This was their way of bringing her to heel, invite her in, remind her of her place, perhaps humiliate her just enough to send her running. Annie set the invitation on her small table, next to the note from Micah she'd found tucked under her door that morning. His handwriting was careful, unpracticed. Finished the book. Would like to discuss M.H. 2 invitations in one day, one designed to diminish her, the other. She wasn't sure what Micah's note meant, but it warmed her in a way Mrs. Pike's summons did not. At the schoolhouse, Miss Thornberry noticed her distraction. The winter social, she guessed during their lunch break. How did you know? Because I received a similar invitation 5 years ago, shortly after I arrived. The teacher's smile was rueful. They wanted to put me in my place. Instead, I met Samuel that night, and ended up staying forever. Samuel is Mr. Pratt's nephew. Indeed, much to his family's initial horror. Miss Thornberry adjusted her spectacles. Are you going? I shouldn't. No, you shouldn't, which is exactly why you must. That evening, Annie found Micah at his usual spot on the warehouse steps, whittling in the fading light. The Whitman book rested beside him, a bookmark, a piece of red yarn marking his place. You wanted to discuss the book, Annie settled beside him, careful to leave proper distance between them. I wanted to understand. He set down his knife, picked up the volume with reverent hands. This part here I am large. I contain multitudes. How can a man write such things? Just say them out loud. Perhaps because he believed them. To believe you contain multitudes. Micah shook his head. Most days I feel lucky to contain one whole self. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're all more than the one story others tell about us. He was quiet for a moment, studying her, like the story they tell about you. The educated woman too proud for her own good, yes, like that. Or the story about me, the drifter who brings trouble. Do you bring trouble? His smile was sad. Seems to find me regardless. But this book, he touched the cover gently, made me think maybe there's more than one way to tell a story. Annie wanted to reach out, to touch his hand the way he touched the book carefully, as if it mattered. Instead, she said, I've been invited to help with the winter social. His expression darkened. Annie, it was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his rough voice made her stomach flutter. I know it's a trap, she said quickly, but I'm going. They'll try to hurt you. It's what they do to women who don't, he gestured helplessly. Who don't bow and scrape, who don't apologize for existing. Annie stood, brushing off her skirts. I've been hurt before. Micah, I survived. This is different. Small towns have long memories and sharp teeth. Then I'll be sharp too. He stood as well, and for a moment they were close enough that she could smell the leather and wood smoke scent of him. Let me come with you. To the ladies' auxiliary meeting. Despite everything, Annie smiled. That would certainly give them something to talk about. I mean to the social. If you're going, you don't attend social functions. I don't. He met her eyes steadily. But I would, for you. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks. I should go, she said. Ruth is coming by for her lesson. Annie, her name again, soft as snowfall. Be careful. When am I not? His laugh was short, almost painful. Every time you open your mouth to tell the truth. The ladies' auxiliary meeting was held in the church basement, a space that smelled of old hymnals and judgment. Annie arrived precisely on time, wearing her best dress black wool, severely cut, proper as a prayer. The room fell silent when she entered. Mrs. Pike presided from a throne-like chair at the front, flanked by her usual coterie. Other women filled the rows of seats. Some Annie recognized from the mercantile, others strangers who watched her with curious or hostile eyes. Miss Calder. Mrs. Pike's voice dripped false honey. How good of you to come. We have so much work to do, and you seem to have time on your hands. Annie took a seat in the back, saying nothing. She'd learned from her father's courtroom stories sometimes silence was the strongest argument. The meeting proceeded with military precision. Tasks were assigned, committees formed, plans laid out like battle strategies. Annie waited, hands folded, expression neutral. Finally, Mrs. Pike turned to her. Miss Calder, we thought you might take charge of the auxiliary decorations, the entrance to the back storage room, specifically. Snickers rippled through the room. The back storage room where the hired help would enter, where the empty bottles and dirty linens would be hidden. The least visible, least important space in the entire social. Of course, Annie said calmly. I'd be happy to help wherever needed. Mrs. Pike's eyes narrowed, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction. And you'll work alone. Naturally, we wouldn't want to impose on the other ladies. Naturally. The theme is Winter's Grace. I trust you can manage something appropriate. More titters. Annie stood, smoothed her skirts, and smiled with all the sweetness she could muster. I'll do my best to ensure the space reflects the spirit of the evening. She left before they could dismiss her. Head high, steps measured, outside. She nearly collided with Ruth Clayton, who'd been hovering near the door. I wanted to come in, Ruth whispered. But I couldn't. They wouldn't. It's all right. Annie squeezed her arm. Walk with me. They headed toward the warehouse district, Ruth's words tumbling out in a rush. It's not fair. You've been nothing but kind, and they treat you like a woman who won't apologize for who she is. Annie's smile was wry. It's a familiar feeling. What will you do about the decorations? Annie thought of Micah's warning, of sharp teeth and long memories. Then she thought of his face when he talked about containing multitudes. I'll give them exactly what they asked for. She said, something appropriate. The night of the social arrived crisp and star-filled. Annie had worked for 3 days on the storage room entrance, allowing no one to see her progress. She'd purchased supplies from Mr. Chen, who'd raised an eyebrow at some of her requests, but filled them without question. Now she stood in her room, wearing the green silk dress she'd saved for her wedding, the wedding that would never happen. Ruth had helped her with her hair, pinning it in an elegant style that emphasized her long neck and stubborn chin. You look beautiful, Ruth breathed. Like a queen. Or a target, Annie murmured. But she was smiling. A knock at the door made them both jump. Micah stood in the hallway, and for a moment, Annie forgot how to breathe. He wore a proper suit, black wool, obviously borrowed but well-fitted. His hair was trimmed, his face clean-shaven, revealing a strong jaw usually hidden by stubble. He looked uncomfortable but determined, like a soldier in unfamiliar armor. Miss Calder, he said formally, then saw Ruth. Mrs. Clayton. You came, Annie said softly. Said I would. He offered his arm. Shall we go scandalize the town? The social was in full swing when they arrived. The church hall blazed with light and music, couples swirling across the dance floor in approved patterns. Conversation stopped like a slammed door when Annie entered on Micah's arm. She felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispers rise like wind through wheat. But Micah's arm was steady under her hand, his presence solid as stone beside her. Breathe, he murmured. They're just people. People with pitchforks, perhaps. His quiet chuckle warmed her. I've faced worse. So have you. Mrs. Pike materialized before them like a bad dream in purple taffeta. Miss Calder and Mr. Hale. She pronounced his name like something scraped off a shoe. How unexpected. I was invited, Annie said pleasantly. I've completed the decorations as requested. Have you, Mrs.? Pike's smile was all teeth. Then by all means, let's see what you've done. A crowd followed them to the back entrance, eager for the expected humiliation. Annie felt Micah tense beside her, but she squeezed his arm gently. Trust me. The storage room entrance, usually a dingy afterthought, had been transformed. Annie had created a winter forest of white birch branches and evergreen boughs, with hundreds of paper stars hanging at different heights. Each star was inscribed with a quote from Whitman. Yes, but also from the Bible, from Shakespeare, from voices both celebrated and common. Lanterns hidden among the branches cast moving shadows, making the stars seem to dance. But it was the banner across the top that made people gasp. We are all more than one story. Below it, smaller text read, Every person who enters here, servant or guest, rich or poor, welcome or unwelcome, carries multitudes within. The silence stretched taut as wire. Annie watched Mrs. Pike's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "It's beautiful," a voice said quietly. Miss Thornberry stepped forward, Samuel at her side. "Simply beautiful." Others began to murmur agreement. Even some of Mrs. Pike's allies seemed moved by the gentle challenge in those paper stars. Each one a reminder that every person was more than their role, their past, their reputation. "It's certainly unique," Mrs. Pike managed, "though hardly traditional." "Neither was Christ," Micah said quietly. "Spent most of his time with people others looked down on, if I recall correctly." Annie had to bite her lip to keep from smiling at the expression on Mrs. Pike's face. The crowd began to disperse, some lingering to read the quotes on the stars. Annie heard one woman whisper to another, "That's from Proverbs. I didn't know she read scripture." "Maybe," the other replied thoughtfully. "We don't know as much as we think." Later, Annie and Micah found a quiet corner where they could watch the dancing. He'd removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, looking more like himself despite the formal setting. "That was—" he shook his head. "I don't have words for what that was." "Appropriate," Annie suggested innocently. "Brave, maybe foolish, definitely beautiful." "Like someone else I know," she said without thinking, then felt heat flood her face. He looked at her for a long moment. "Annie Calder," he said slowly. "Would you dance with me?" "You know what they'll say." "Let them. I'm the only one you dance with anyway." She recognized her own words from weeks ago, thrown back like a gift. As he led her onto the floor, she felt the room's attention sharpen, but the music was sweet and Micah's hand was warm on her waist. And for once she didn't care about the consequences. "You read the whole book?" she asked as they moved together. 3 times. His voice was wondering. "Each time I found something new. Like those stars, each one a different story." "We're all more than one story," Annie repeated. "Even in Dustwell." "Especially in Dustwell," he corrected. "Just take someone brave enough to point it out." They danced until the music ended, and then once more when the fiddler, caught up in the moment, started another tune without being asked. Around them, Annie caught glimpses of faces, some disapproving. Yes, but others thoughtful, considering. Ruth Clayton danced past in the arms of Mr. Chen's son, her face bright with defiance and joy. Miss Thornberry and Samuel whirled by, both grinning. Even some of the proper ladies seemed softer, their whispers less sharp. Not everyone. Mrs. Pike and her core group huddled like crows in a corner, clearly plotting retribution. There would be consequences. Annie knew. There always were. But tonight, in a room decorated with stars and possibilities, dancing with a man who'd learned to read Whitman, Annie felt something shift in Dustwell's foundations. Just a tremor, perhaps. But sometimes that's how avalanches started. "Thank you," she whispered against Micah's shoulder. "For what?" "For coming, for staying, for being more than your one story." His arm tightened around her waist. "Thank you for showing me I could be." Later, walking home through streets dusted with new snow, Annie thought about small revolutions, about paper stars and borrowed suits and women dancing with men they weren't supposed to notice, about the way change came not in grand gestures but in small acts of defiant grace. At her door, Micah paused. "They'll make it harder for you now. Tonight embarrassed them." "I know." "I'll be here, whatever comes." "I know that, too." He touched her face gently, just the briefest brush of fingers against her cheek. Then he was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow. Annie climbed the stairs to her room, her cheek still warm from his touch. The warehouse walls seemed to breathe around her, welcoming her home. She lit her lamp and saw a paper star on her table, one Micah must have taken from the decorations. The quote, in his careful handwriting, "I am not contained between my hat and boots." Annie smiled, pressed the star between the pages of a book, and prepared for whatever morning would bring. She'd shown them all that there was more than one way to belong in Dustwell. Now she just had to survive the consequences. The walk back from the social felt like moving through a dream made of snowflakes and starlight. Annie's feet barely touched the ground, her mind still spinning with the warmth of Micah's hand in hers, the defiant joy of dancing in front of the whole town. But as she climbed the warehouse stairs, reality crept back in like cold through the cracks in the walls. Her door stood slightly ajar. Annie froze, one hand reaching instinctively for the small knife she'd taken to carrying in her pocket. The door had been locked when she left, she was certain of it. Slowly, she pushed it open. The room was in shambles. Her clothes lay scattered across the floor, torn and muddied. The small table was overturned, her few books splayed open, pages ripped out, and across the wall, in what looked like rust-colored paint but smelled suspiciously of blood, someone had written, "Leave." Annie stood very still, cataloging the damage with the same detachment her father had taught her to use in crisis. The books could be mended. The clothes, most were beyond saving. Her small store of food had been dumped and spoiled. But it was the violated sense of safety that cut deepest. The knowledge that someone had been here, touched her things, left their hatred smeared across her walls. Footsteps on the stairs made her whirl. But it was only Ruth, still in her dancing dress, her face flushed with cold and excitement that died the moment she saw Annie's expression. "Oh no," Ruth breathed, looking past her into the room. "Oh, Annie, it's just things," Annie said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Things can be replaced." But her hands shook as she began gathering the torn pages, trying to match them to their books. Ruth knelt beside her, and together they worked in silence, salvaging what they could. When Micah arrived, because somehow Annie had known he would come, had counted on it, he took in the scene with one sweep of his gray eyes and went very, very still. "Who?" The single word carried enough ice to rival the winter outside. "Does it matter?" Annie didn't look up from the book she was trying to piece together. "Mrs. Pike, her friends, someone they hired. The message is clear enough." "Annie." "I need water," she interrupted, "to clean the wall, and rags." He left without argument, returning with a bucket and clean cloths. Ruth had lit the stove, and slowly warmth began to creep back into the room. They worked together, the three of them, turning chaos back to order. Micah rehanging the door properly, reinforcing the lock. Ruth sorting through clothes, setting aside what might be mended. Annie scrubbing at the wall until her arms ached and the ugly word faded to a brown shadow. It was past midnight when they finished. Ruth had long since returned to her daughter, but not before pressing Annie's hand and promising to bring breakfast in the morning. Now it was just Annie and Micah, sitting on the floor near the stove, sharing the last of his flask of whiskey. "You should leave," Micah said quietly. "Take the morning stage. Find somewhere that doesn't—" "No." "Annie, this is just the beginning. They'll escalate. They always do when they're threatened." "Then they'll escalate." She took another sip of whiskey, felt it burn down her throat like liquid courage. "I'm not running. Not again." "This isn't about pride." "Isn't it?" She turned to face him fully. "They want me gone because I won't shrink myself to fit their expectations, because I dared to create something beautiful in a space they meant for shame, because I danced with you." Her voice softened on the last words. "Are those not things worth being proud of?" He was quiet for a long moment, firelight playing across his weathered features. "You could get hurt, worse than tonight. So could you. Doesn't stop you from staying." "That's different." "Why?" "Because I'm already broken," he said simply. "Got nothing left to lose, but you." He gestured helplessly. "You're whole, bright. You could go somewhere and start fresh." Annie laughed, but it came out cracked. Whole, I'm a woman who reads too much and speaks too plainly, who couldn't even hold on to a man who professed to love me because I refused to pretend stupidity. I'm as broken as anyone. Micah, I just hide it better. You're not broken, he said fiercely. You're magnificent. The word hung between them like a struck bell. Annie felt tears prick her eyes from exhaustion, from fear, from the overwhelming tenderness in his voice. Then let me be magnificent here, she whispered. Let me fight for my place instead of always running to the next town, the next disappointment. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from his boots. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. That got a small smile. What do you need? Help replacing the lock, a place to store anything valuable when I'm at the school, and... She hesitated, then forged ahead. Someone to teach me to shoot. His eyebrows rose. Shoot. My father believed in education, but drew the line at firearms. Said ladies had no need, but I'm thinking he never met Mrs. Pike. Now you can't shoot Mrs. Pike. I don't intend to, but I want them to know I could. Sometimes the threat is worth more than the action. He studied her for a long moment. All right, I'll teach you. But Annie... He reached out, touched her hand briefly. Don't let them make you hard. That brightness in you, it's rare. Don't let them steal it. She turned her hand palm up, laced her fingers through his. I won't if you won't. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands linked, drawing strength from each other's stubbornness. When Micah finally left, Annie barricaded the door with a chair and lay down fully dressed, the knife under her pillow. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every creak of the old building. Morning brought Ruth with fresh bread and strong coffee, her face set in determined lines. I heard what happened, she said without preamble. The whole town's talking, and some are saying you got what you deserved, but others... Ruth smiled grimly. Others are asking why a woman needs to be run out of town for dancing and decorating. Mr. Chen said 3 different women came to his store this morning, saying they were ashamed of what happened. 3 out of how many? It's a start. Ruth poured coffee, handed Annie a cup. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens one person at a time, deciding to see differently. The school day was tense. Some parents had kept their children home, but others had sent them with notes of support. Miss Thornberry stood before the half-empty classroom with her chin high. Some of you, she said clearly, may have heard about last night's events. Let me be clear, Miss Calder remains my assistant, and any student who cannot show her proper respect is welcome to continue their education elsewhere. Bobby Daniels raised his hand. My ma says Miss Annie's a troublemaker. And what do you think, Robert? The boy considered. I think she makes numbers make sense, and she don't hit us when we get things wrong. Doesn't hit? Miss Thornberry corrected gently. And yes, those are both valuable qualities in a teacher. The day passed without major incident, though Annie noticed the way some children watched her, as if expecting her to sprout horns or burst into flames. She taught with her usual patience, refused to let her exhaustion show, and counted it a victory when Bobby Daniels stayed after class to ask for extra help with his multiplication tables. That afternoon, Micah met her at an abandoned homestead outside town. He'd brought an old revolver, its weight surprising in her hands. First rule, he said, standing behind her, adjusting her grip. Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Seems applicable to words as well, Annie muttered, making him chuckle. Second rule, it's not about being fast, it's about being steady. Sure, like everything else in life. He was a patient teacher, correcting her stance, showing her how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. The first shot went wild, the recoil shocking her. The second was better. By the 10th, she was hitting the makeshift target more often than not. You're a natural, Micah said, and she could hear the surprise in his voice. I had a good teacher. Annie. He took the gun from her, checked it was empty, set it aside. What happened last night? It won't be the last time. I know. And you're staying anyway? I am. She met his eyes. Are you trying to talk me out of it again? No. He stepped closer, and she could smell gunpowder and leather, see the concern written in every line of his face. I'm trying to tell you that I'm staying too, whatever comes. Because the warehouse won't let you leave. She tried for lightness, but her voice came out breathless. Because you won't let me leave. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I have a reason to stay. Annie closed her eyes, leaned into his touch. Micah. I know all the reasons this is foolish, he continued quietly. Know what they'll say, what they'll do. But standing in that room last night, seeing what they'd done, all I could think was how I'd tear this town apart if they'd hurt you, and that terrified me more than anything. Why? Because I'd sworn never to care that much again, never to let anyone matter enough to make me lose control. His other hand came up, cradling her face between his palms. But you walked into my life with your books and your stubborn chin and your refusal to be less than you are, and all my walls just crumbled. Annie opened her eyes, saw her own feelings reflected in his storm-gray gaze. I won't ask you to fight my battles. I know. That's part of why I want to. His forehead touched hers, a point of warmth in the winter air. Let me stand beside you. Not in front, not behind, beside. Yes, she whispered, and wasn't sure if she was answering his stated request or some deeper question that hummed in the air between them. When he kissed her, it was gentle as snowfall, careful as his hands with the gun. Annie had been kissed before by Beau in Philadelphia. Even once by Reverend Morrison in a moment of passion he'd immediately apologized for. But this was different. This was recognition, was coming home, was finding shelter in a storm. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Annie laughed softly. Mrs. Pike will have apoplexy. Good, Micah said fiercely, then kissed her again. They stayed until sunset, practicing with the gun, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the war, about nights when the only thing between him and madness was the memory of Mary Catherine's laugh. She told him about her father's death, how she'd found him slumped over his law books, still fighting for justice even as his heart gave out. We're a pair, Micah said as they walked back toward town. The woman who won't be silenced and the man who can't settle down. Maybe that's what makes us work, Annie suggested. We understand each other's damage. Or maybe, he said, taking her hand, we understand each other's strength. They parted at the warehouse steps, Annie reluctantly letting go of his hand. Will I see you tomorrow? Every day you want me. That might be a very long time. I'm counting on it. Annie climbed the stairs to find a package outside her door. Inside was a new dress, simple but well-made, and a note in Ruth's careful handwriting. From those of us who believe in second chances, and third ones, and as many as it takes. She hung the dress carefully, checked her reinforced lock twice, and prepared for bed with her gun on the nightstand. Outside, she could hear footsteps on the street, voices raised in anger or alcohol or both. But inside, she was warm and armed and not alone. The warehouse had kept its promise she couldn't leave now, wouldn't leave. But maybe that was all right. Maybe home wasn't a place that welcomed you with open arms. Maybe it was a place you carved out with your own stubborn hands, defended with whatever weapons you could find, and filled with people who understood that belonging wasn't given but taken, wasn't comfortable but worth it. Annie smiled in the darkness, thinking of Micah's hand steadying hers on the gun, of Ruth's determined friendship, of Bobby Daniels staying after school, thinking of paper stars and dances that changed things. Let them come, she thought. Let them try to drive her out. She was magnificent. She was armed. She was home. The night of the fire. Annie woke to the sound of bells, not the measured toll of Sunday service, but the frantic clanging that meant disaster. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before her mind fully registered what was happening. Through her window, she could see an orange glow painting the sky above Main Street. By the time she reached the scene, half the town was already there. The Riverside Inn, Dustwell's only respectable lodging house, was ablaze. Flames licked from the lower windows while smoke poured from the upper floors. A bucket brigade had formed, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. "There's people still inside," someone shouted. "The Weatherby children, their parents are away." Annie's heart clenched. She knew those children, Sarah, age 8, and little Thomas, barely 5. Sarah was one of her students, a bright girl who loved arithmetic almost as much as she loved her baby brother. Without thinking, Annie pushed through the crowd. The heat hit her like a physical wall, but she could hear crying from somewhere above. Others milled about, shouting instructions, but no one was moving toward the building. Then Micah was there, appearing from the smoke like a guardian angel covered in soot. "Third floor," he said tersely. "Backstairs might still be clear." They moved together without need for words. Annie held her skirts high, following Micah through the inn's kitchen entrance. The smoke was thicker here, coating her throat, making her eyes stream. Micah kicked open the stairwell door, and they climbed, the heat growing more intense with each step. On the 3rd floor, they could hear the children clearly now, terrified, sobbing from behind a closed door. Micah tried the handle, cursed when it wouldn't budge. "Stand back," he ordered, then threw his shoulder against the wood, once, twice, and on the 3rd impact the door splintered open. Sarah Weatherby stood in the middle of the room, clutching Thomas, both children in their nightclothes and wide-eyed with terror. The window was open. Sarah had been smart enough to try for fresh air, but they were too high to jump. "Miss Annie," Sarah cried, and Annie's heart broke at the relief in her voice. "We're getting you out," Annie said, forcing calm into her tone. "Right now." Micah was already moving, scooping up Thomas while Annie took Sarah's hand. The hallway was filling with smoke now, the stairs they'd climbed no longer visible. Micah led them the other direction, toward the front of the building. "Service stairs," he said over his shoulder. "Might still be." The floor beneath them groaned, and Annie felt it shift. Time slowed as she realized what was happening, pulled Sarah hard against her just as the boards gave way. Micah lunged forward. Thomas clutched to his chest, reaching the solid ground beyond the collapsing section. For a moment, Annie teetered on the edge, Sarah's weight pulling her toward the hole that had opened in the floor. Then, strong hands grabbed her shoulders, Micah, having thrust Thomas to safety, hauling both her and Sarah across the gap. They stumbled down the service stairs, the air growing clearer but the sound of the fire growing louder. Burst out into the street to find the crowd had swelled. Someone, Annie thought it might be Doc Hayworth, took the children from them, checking them over while Annie and Micah collapsed onto the boardwalk, coughing and gasping. "You damn fool woman," someone said, and Annie looked up to find Mrs. Pike standing over her, face twisted with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "You could have been killed." "The children," Annie gasped out, "are fine, thanks to your foolishness." "Mrs." Pike's voice broke on the last word, and Annie realized with shock that the older woman was crying. "My own nephew boards in that inn. If you hadn't gone in, shown the way." She didn't finish, just turned and walked stiffly away, but not before Annie saw her dash tears from her cheeks. The fire was contained by dawn. The inn a total loss, but the flames prevented from spreading to neighboring buildings. Annie sat on the steps of the church, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown around her shoulders, watching the sunrise paint the smoke-stained sky. Micah sat beside her, his own blanket draped loose, revealing angry burns on his hands where he'd grabbed hot metal getting the children out. Doc Hayworth had bandaged them, muttering about heroes and fools being cut from the same cloth. "You all right?" Micah asked quietly. "Define all right." Annie's voice was hoarse from smoke. "I'm alive. The children are safe. That's what matters. Annie, he waited until she looked at him. When that floor went, when I thought, he stopped, jaw working. Don't do that to me again. I won't if you won't. Deal. They sat in companionable silence, watching the town slowly come back to life. People milled about, some still fighting the last of the flames, others beginning the cleanup. Annie noticed something different in how they moved, an energy that hadn't been there before. Miss Calder. Annie looked up to find a small crowd had gathered. Mr. Weatherby stood at the front, his wife beside him, both still in traveling clothes. They must have ridden through the night when word reached them. We wanted to thank you, Mrs. Weatherby said, tears streaming down her face. What you did for our babies. Anyone would have... No, Mr. Weatherby interrupted firmly. They wouldn't have. They didn't. You and Mr. Hale did. Behind them, Annie saw others nodding, some of the same faces that had turned away from her in the street, that had whispered behind hands when she passed. Now they looked at her with something new respect, maybe, or at least reconsideration. The town council's meeting, someone called out, deciding about the inn, about rebuilding, and about other things. Mr. Chen added quietly, appearing at Annie's elbow, about who belongs in Dustwell, who contributes. The crowd began to disperse, heading toward the town hall. Mr. Chen lingered, studying Annie and Micah with knowing eyes. Change comes in many forms, he said. Sometimes it requires a fire to clear away old growth, make room for new. He paused. The inn will need teachers for the children while they rebuild. Many families lost their homes. Someone suggested a temporary school, someone who could help the displaced children keep up with their studies. He walked away before Annie could respond, but his meaning was clear. An opportunity was opening, if she was brave enough to take it. You should go home, Micah said. Rest. So should you. Neither of them moved. The sun climbed higher, burning off the smoke, revealing a town that looked different in the morning light. Scarred, yes, but also open somehow, like a fist slowly unclenching. Ruth appeared with coffee and fresh bread, somehow managing to look composed despite the early hour and the chaos. Thought you might need this, she said, pressing warm cups into their hands. The whole town's talking about what you did. Talking good or bad? Annie asked, only half joking. Both, always both in Dustwell. Ruth smiled. But more good than yesterday. And that's something. By full daylight, the immediate crisis had passed. The injured were tended, the homeless given temporary shelter. Annie finally made her way back to the warehouse, Micah insisting on walking her despite his bandaged hands. At her door, they paused. Annie could feel the weight of the night in her bones, the close call with death, the strange shift in the town's attitude. She was exhausted, but also strangely exhilarated. They'll need help, she said. With the children, with rebuilding, all of it. They will. I want to help, but I don't know if they'll let me. Micah touched her face gently with his bandaged hand. After tonight, I think you'll be surprised. She caught his hand, held it carefully. We make a good team. The best. He leaned down, kissed her forehead. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be complicated enough. But Annie didn't rest. She couldn't. Instead, she sat at her small table and made lists. What the displaced children would need, how to organize lessons without a proper classroom, which families had lost the most and would need the most help. A knock interrupted her planning. She opened the door to find Mrs. Pike standing there, looking older and more uncertain than Annie had ever seen her. May I come in? Too surprised to refuse, Annie stepped aside. Mrs. Pike entered, taking in the simple room, the evidence of the vandalism still faintly visible on the wall. I owe you an apology. Mrs. Pike said without preamble. Not just for last night, though certainly for that, but for all of it. Annie sank into a chair, gesturing for Mrs. Pike to take the other. I don't understand. My nephew, James, he's like you. Too smart for his own good. His father says, reads everything, questions everything. I've spent so long trying to force him into the shape this town expects. Mrs. Pike's hands twisted in her lap. When you arrived, defending your education, refusing to apologize for your mind, you reminded me of everything I've been trying to beat out of that boy. Mrs. Pike. I was afraid, the older woman continued. Afraid that if we allowed you to be yourself, openly, proudly, then James might think he could too. And this town, it's not always kind to those who think differently. So you tried to drive me out. I tried to protect him and myself and the order of things. Mrs. Pike looked up, met Annie's eyes. But last night, when you ran into that fire, James was watching. He said, Aunt Helen, she's magnificent. And I realized I'd been trying to stamp out magnificence because I was afraid of it. Annie felt tears prick her eyes. Change is frightening. Yes, but necessary, perhaps. Mrs. Pike stood. I can't undo what I did. The dress, the vandalism, I didn't order it. But I created the atmosphere that allowed it. I know that, but I can do better going forward. She moved toward the door, then paused. The town council is meeting in an hour. They're discussing emergency measures, including education for the displaced children. Your name has been mentioned. It would help if you had support from established members of the community. Are you offering? I'm trying to... Mrs. Pike's smile was rueful. I'm not very good at humility, but I'm learning. After she left, Annie sat in stunned silence. The world had shifted again. As dramatically as any earthquake, her enemy extending a hand, the town that had rejected her now needing what she could offer. Another knock came, this time revealing Miss Thornberry and several other women, including some Annie recognized from the ladies' auxiliary. We've come to ask for your help, Miss Thornberry said simply. We need to organize relief efforts, food, clothing, temporary schooling. You've shown you can organize, can inspire. Will you help us? Annie looked at the women crowded in her doorway. Some still seemed uncomfortable, uncertain, but they were here. They were asking. Of course, she said. Where do we start? They worked through the morning, planning and organizing. Word spread, and more women arrived, some bringing supplies, others offering skills. Even Ruth joined them, Emma playing quietly in the corner while her mother took notes. By the time the town council meeting convened, they had a full proposal ready. Temporary classroom space in the church basement, rotating teachers to handle the increased load, donation drives for supplies and clothing. Annie presented their plan to the all-male council, Micah watching from the back of the room with bandaged hands and proud eyes. She spoke clearly, confidently, outlining not just the immediate needs, but a vision for how Dustwell could emerge stronger from this crisis. Who would oversee this effort? Councilman Morrison asked, no relation to Annie's former intended. Thankfully, I would, Annie said, with Miss Thornberry and a committee of volunteers. You're rather new to our community, Miss Calder. New perspectives can be valuable. Mrs. Pike said from the audience, standing slowly. As we've recently seen. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Pike supporting the scandalous warehouse woman. The world truly had turned upside down. The vote was closer than Annie would have liked, but it passed. As people filed out, discussing the changes to come, Micah made his way to her side. Magnificent, he murmured, and Annie heard the echo of Mrs. Pike's nephew in the word. We did it, she said, still hardly believing. You did it. I just tried to keep up. They walked out together into a town transformed by fire and necessity. There would still be resistance. Annie knew. Not everyone would accept change gracefully. But something fundamental had shifted in Dustwell's foundations. At the warehouse, Micah paused. I should tell you something. Harlan offered me steady work, a permanent position at the livery. Said the town needs reliable men, especially now. Annie's heart jumped. And I said I'd think about it. He met her eyes. Depends on whether I have a reason to stop drifting. I think, Annie said carefully, that Dustwell needs all the magnificent people it can get, drifters included. Is that your way of asking me to stay? It's my way of saying I can't imagine doing this without you. He kissed her then, there in the street where anyone could see. And Annie didn't care. They'd earned this moment, paid for it in smoke and fear and courage. When they parted, she saw faces in windows, people watching. Let them watch. Let them see that Dustwell could be a place where different kinds of people found home, where courage was recognized regardless of its source, where change came not from forcing everyone into the same mold, but from making room for all the shapes people could take. Stay, she said simply. Always, he replied. And in a town still smoldering from old destructions, Annie Calder and Micah Hale began building something new. 2 weeks after the fire, Dustwell was attempting to stitch itself back together like a patchwork quilt made of salvaged pieces. The temporary school in the church basement was running, crowded but functional. Annie spent her days teaching mathematics to groups twice the usual size, her evenings coordinating relief efforts with the growing committee of women who had, surprisingly, continued to show up. The change in town wasn't complete far from it. There were still cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, but there were also nods of acknowledgement, small smiles, children who ran to greet her in the street. It was Thursday morning when Micah appeared at the schoolhouse door, his face grave. Annie was in the middle of explaining long division to the older students, but something in his expression made her set down her chalk. Miss Thornberry, she said quietly, could you take over for a moment? Outside, Micah didn't waste words. I'm leaving. The world tilted. Annie reached for the wall to steady herself. What? Not leaving you, he said quickly, catching her hand. But I need to go back to Texas. Just for a few weeks. I don't understand. He pulled a crumpled telegram from his pocket. Mary Catherine's mother. She's dying, asking for me. Annie read the brief message, her heart sinking. She'd never considered that Micah's past might call him back, might have claims on him that preceded anything growing between them. Of course you must go, she said, proud of how steady her voice remained. Annie. He cupped her face in his hands, healed now from the fire, though new scars joined the old. I'm coming back. You say that now? I mean it. His gray eyes were fierce. I've spent 5 years running from that place, from those memories. But I'm not running anymore. This is my home now. You're my home. Micah. Her voice broke on his name. I need to say goodbye properly. To her family. To the man I was. He rested his forehead against hers. So I can come back as the man I want to be. Annie closed her eyes, breathing him in. When do you leave? Tomorrow's stage. Then we have tonight. They spent the afternoon as normally as possible, Annie teaching, Micah working at the livery. But as evening fell, they found themselves walking the path to the abandoned homestead where he'd taught her to shoot. The December air was sharp with the promise of snow. I have something for you, Micah said, producing a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather journal, beautifully bound, with her initials embossed on the cover. For your thoughts, he said, the one's too big for ordinary conversation. It's beautiful. Annie ran her fingers over the smooth leather. But I have nothing. You've given me everything, he interrupted. A reason to stay still, to want something beyond the next town, the next job. You've given me a future. Annie Calder. Then come back to claim it, she whispered. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, full of promises and fears. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "Write to me," Annie said. "Let me know you're safe." "Every town I stop in." They walked back as the first stars appeared, hands clasped tight. "At the warehouse." Micah paused. "If I asked you to wait for me?" "You don't need to ask." Annie said simply, "I'll be here." The next morning, half the town seemed to gather at the stage depot. Word had spread about Micah's departure and the reason for it. Annie stood with Ruth and Miss Thornberry, chin high despite the tears threatening to fall. Harlan Pike shook Micah's hand. "Job's waiting when you get back," he said gruffly. "Even Mrs." Pike approached, pressing a small package into Micah's hands. "Traveling food," she said briskly. "The stage stops serve swill." Micah looked stunned by the small kindnesses. The acknowledgement that he belonged here was expected back. He caught Annie's eyes over the crowd, and she saw her own emotions reflected there, love and fear and determination mixed in equal parts. "Take care of her," he said to Ruth, loud enough for others to hear. "Take care of yourself," Ruth retorted. "She's perfectly capable of managing without you. She just shouldn't have to." The stage driver called for passengers. Micah shouldered his small bag, touched his hat brim to the assembled crowd. Then he was at Annie's side, uncaring of propriety or audience. "I love you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Remember that, whatever you hear, whatever anyone says while I'm gone, I love you, and I'm coming back." "I love you too," Annie whispered. "Go, make your peace, then come home." He kissed her forehead, a benediction and a promise, then climbed aboard the stage. Annie stood watching until dust and distance swallowed the coach, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart beat wild as a caged bird. "Come on," Ruth said gently, taking her arm. "Let's get you some tea." The first week was the hardest. Annie threw herself into work with fierce determination, expanding the temporary school, organizing clothing drives, visiting families still displaced by the fire. But at night, alone in her warehouse room, the silence pressed against her like a living thing. She started writing in the journal Micah had given her, filling pages with thoughts she couldn't speak aloud. "The town watches me for signs of collapse. I refuse to give them the satisfaction. But oh, the nights are long without even the hope of his footsteps on the stairs." Asterisk. A letter came at the end of the second week, posted from a way station in Kansas. "My dear Annie, the road is long and every mile takes me further from where I want to be. But each mile also brings me closer to being free to return. I think of you constantly, of your fierce eyes when you defended me to Mrs. Pike, of your gentle hands tending my wounds, of your stubborn chin when you refused to back down from what's right. The stars are the same here as there. I watch them and know you see them too. All my love, Micah." Annie read it until the words blurred, then carefully tucked it into her journal. The opposition to her position hadn't disappeared with Micah's departure, if anything. Some saw his absence as an opportunity. Anonymous notes appeared under her door. Parents pulled children from her classes. The temporary school funding was challenged at a town meeting. But Annie had allies now. Mrs. Pike, transformed into an unlikely champion, argued forcefully for continuing the program. Miss Thornberry marshaled the teachers. Ruth organized the mothers whose children benefited from the expanded schooling. "They're testing you," Mr. Chen observed one afternoon when Annie stopped by his store. "Seeing if you'll fold without your protector." "He's not my protector," Annie said firmly. "He's my partner. There's a difference." Mr. Chen smiled. "Yes, and that difference is why you'll survive this test." The third week brought disturbing news from other sources. Jake Morrison, the Reverend's brother, had taken to drinking heavily and telling anyone who'd listened that Micah had abandoned Annie just like everyone knew he would. Gone back to Texas, where he belongs. Jake slurred one evening in the saloon, loud enough for the gossip to reach Annie by morning. Probably got a woman there waiting. These drifter types always do. Annie heard the whispers, saw the pitying looks, and kept her head high, but doubt crept in during the dark hours. What if something had happened? What if seeing his old life had reminded Micah of all he'd left behind? What if? Another letter arrived, this time from Oklahoma Territory. Dearest, storms have slowed my progress. I shelter tonight in a barn that reminds me of Harlan's, except Harlan's has you nearby and so is infinitely superior. I helped the family here repair their roof in exchange for supper. The wife asked if I had someone waiting. I told her yes, the finest woman in Colorado, who can shoot straight and think straighter and makes every other woman look dim by comparison. She laughed and said I'd better hurry back before you realize you can do better. I told her that was my greatest fear and my greatest motivation. Soon, my love, soon. Yours entirely, Micah. That Sunday, Annie attended church for the first time since the social. She sat in the back, spine straight, ignoring the whispers. Reverend Blackwood, older and kinder than her former intended, spoke about faith during trials. Sometimes, he said, looking directly at Annie, we are tested not to break us, but to show us how strong we've already become. After the service, a surprising number of people approached her, some offering support, others asking about the school, a few even inquiring about Micah's return. The tide wasn't fully turned, but it was shifting. The fourth week brought the harshest test yet. Annie was returning from an evening meeting when she found her door ajar again. Her heart sank, remembering the last time, but inside, instead of destruction. She found Jake Morrison rifling through her papers. Looking for something? She asked coldly. He whirled, whiskey breath preceding him like a fog. Letters, from him. Gonna prove he's not coming back. Get out. You think you're so high and mighty, Jake snarled. Too good for my brother, too good for this town. But he left you, just like everyone said he would. And when people realize that... Realize what? Annie stepped closer, her hand moving to the pocket where she'd taken to carrying the small derringer Micah had left her. That a man went to attend a dying woman who was mother to his late wife, that he had the decency to say goodbye properly before starting a new life. What exactly is shameful in that? He's not coming back, Jake insisted. Men like him never... The door burst open. Ruth stood there with Harlan Pike and, surprisingly, Councilman Morrison. Jake, Morrison said wearily. Come away. You're drunk again. She needs to know... What she needs, Harlan interrupted, is for you to leave her property before I help you along. Jake left, stumbling and muttering. Morrison lingered, hat in hands. I apologize for my brother. Miss Calder, he's had difficulties since you declined Reverend Morrison's proposal. Seems to have taken it personally. The Reverend is your relation. Cousin, back in Pennsylvania. Morrison looked uncomfortable. He wrote, you see, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd let a remarkable woman go because he was too small-minded to appreciate her. Jake, well, he's always been protective of family. Annie felt a peculiar lightness, as if a weight she hadn't known she carried had lifted. The Reverend has no obligation to me, nor I to him. I wish him well in finding a more suitable partner. Morrison nodded. The town council meets tomorrow, about making the temporary school permanent. You'll have my vote for what it's worth. After they left, Annie sank into her chair, shaking slightly. Ruth pressed a cup of tea into her hands. You all right? Yes. Annie was surprised to find it was true. Yes, I think I am. That night, she wrote her own letter. My dearest Micah, the town tests me daily, but I find I am stronger than they know, perhaps stronger than I knew. Your faith in me has become my faith in myself. I teach, I organize, I stand firm when they push. Some push back, others begin to stand with me. I miss you like a lost limb, but I also know now that I can stand alone if needed. Not because I want to, but because you helped me remember that I could come back when you're ready. I'll be here not waiting, but building a life big enough for both of us, in a town that's slowly learning to expand its definitions. All my love, your Annie. The 5th week brought spring's first hints and Micah's final letter. Tomorrow I board the stage home. Mary Catherine's mother passed peacefully, having said her goodbyes. I've said mine as well to the past, to the guilt, to the man who didn't know how to stay. I'm free now. Annie, free to come home, to you, to the life we'll build together. Expect me when you see me, but expect me soon. Forever yours, Micah. Annie pressed the letter to her chest and smiled. Around her, Dustwell was waking up from winter, stretching into new possibilities. The temporary school had been made permanent. 3 more women had joined the teaching staff, even Mrs. Pike had started a reading group, pointedly including all interested parties, regardless of their address. There was still work to do, minds to change, battles to fight. But Annie no longer felt alone in the fighting. She moved to the window, looking out at the road that would bring him back. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. And when he came, he'd find her not where he'd left her, but further along the path they'd chosen to walk together. Still magnificent, still stubborn, still his. But also, fully and finally, her own. The storm arrived without warning on the first day of March, rolling down from the mountains like an avalanche made of wind and ice. Annie had just dismissed the afternoon classes when the sky turned the color of old pewter and the temperature plummeted. "Everyone stay calm," Miss Thornberry announced as parents began arriving to collect their children, fighting against winds that threatened to tear the doors from their hinges. "We'll wait here until—" A tremendous crack split the air. Through the church windows, they watched the old elm tree in the square topple, taking part of the mercantile's roof with it. Children began to cry. "The warehouse district," someone shouted over the wind. "Those old buildings won't stand in this—" Annie's heart seized. Ruth and Emma were home, along with several other families who'd taken shelter in the converted warehouse spaces after the fire. She grabbed her coat. "Where are you going?" Miss Thornberry caught her arm. "I have to check on Ruth. The others—" "You can't go out in this." But Annie was already moving. She'd learned to shoot, to stand up to the town's judgment, to survive Micah's absence. She wouldn't cower now while people needed help. The wind hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. Ice pellets stung her face, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Annie struggled forward, using buildings as guideposts, her skirts whipping around her legs. She was halfway to the warehouse when she heard a child scream, high and terrified. Through the swirling snow, she saw a small figure clinging to a lamppost as the wind tried to tear them away. It was James Pike, Mrs. Pike's nephew. Annie didn't think. She plunged into the street, catching the boy just as his grip failed. The wind immediately tried to claim them both, but Annie dragged them into the shelter of the bakery doorway. "Miss Annie," James sobbed against her shoulder. "I was coming to find Aunt Helen, but the storm—" "Shh, it's all right." Annie held him tight, mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The bakery's windows were already cracking under the assault, but moving meant facing the wind again. "Can you be brave for me?" she asked. James nodded, though his thin body shook with cold and fear. "Good. We're going to the warehouse. It's closer than going back. Hold tight to me and don't let go, no matter what." They ventured back into the storm, Annie shielding the boy with her body. Each step was a battle against wind that seemed determined to pluck them from the earth. Debris flew past shingles, branches, pieces of lives torn loose and scattered. The warehouse loomed through the snow like a haven. Annie pounded on the door until Ruth opened it, her face flooding with relief. "Thank God we were worried sick, James." "Found him in the street." Annie gasped, pushing the boy inside. "How many are here?" 15, maybe 20. We've moved everyone to the inner rooms, away from windows. Annie looked around, assessing. The warehouse was old but solid, built to store grain and withstand seasons. It might be their best chance. We need to prepare for others. This storm, people will need shelter. They worked quickly, Ruth and the other women organizing blankets, water, what food they had. Annie stationed herself by the door, ready to answer knocks. And they came families whose roofs had torn away, travelers caught between towns, even some who'd scorned the warehouse district before, but now needed its solid walls. Among them came Mrs. Pike, wild-eyed and frantic. "James?" She fell to her knees beside her nephew, gathering him close. "I couldn't find you. The storm came so fast." "Miss Annie saved me," James announced. "She came out in the storm just for me." "Mrs. Pike looked up at Annie, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Anyone would have—" "No, Mrs." Pike stood, still clutching James's hand. "No, they wouldn't. I would have waited for someone else to be brave." The storm raged for hours. They lost windows despite their precautions, snow driving in through the gaps. Annie organized the men to nail boards over the openings while the women corralled the children into the safest spaces. Someone started singing hymns, and soon others joined in, voices rising against the howling wind. It was past midnight when Annie heard something different in the storm's voice. A human shout, desperate and repeated. She peered through a crack in the boarded window, but saw only swirling white. "Someone's out there," she said. "You can't go back out," Ruth protested. "Annie, no." But Annie was already wrapping herself in every layer she could find. "Get rope," she ordered. "Tie one end to me, the other to something solid." "This is madness," Mrs. Pike said, but she was already helping to secure the rope around Annie's waist. Annie opened the door to a blast of wind and snow. The shout came again, closer now. She followed the sound, the rope playing out behind her, until she literally stumbled over a figure collapsed in the snow. Her hands found shoulders, a face. Micah. His name came out as a sob. He was nearly frozen, lips blue, but his eyes opened at her voice. "Annie, you impossible man," she gasped, hauling him upright. "What are you doing?" Came back, stage overturned, walked. She didn't waste breath on more words, just dragged him back along the rope's path to the warehouse. Hands reached out to pull them both inside, and suddenly the space was full of exclamations and movement. "Get him by the stove," someone ordered Doc Hayworth. Annie realized who'd taken shelter with them. "Slowly. Don't warm him too fast." Annie stayed by Micah's side as feeling returned to his limbs, as color crept back into his face. His hand found hers and held tight. "Couldn't wait," he whispered. "Storm hit while we were traveling. Driver tried to push through, but the stage went over. I was the only one who could walk, so I walked. In a blizzard, you walked through a blizzard. Had to get home." His gray eyes found hers. "Had to get to you." "Fool," she said, but she was crying. "Beautiful, impossible fool." Around them, the warehouse had become a small city of refugees. Annie saw Jake Morrison helping to distribute blankets, his animosity apparently frozen out of him. Councilman Morrison worked alongside Mr. Chen to reinforce the doors. Children played in corners while their parents shared worried glances and whatever food they had. "Look at this," Micah murmured, taking in the scene. "You did this." "We all did this. The storm just reminded us what matters." "No." His hand tightened on hers. "You changed this town. Annie gave it a different story to tell about itself." Dawn came slowly, the wind finally dying as light crept across a transformed landscape. When they opened the doors, Dustwell looked like a different world, white and clean and somehow smaller under its blanket of snow. The damage was significant. Roofs gone, Windows shattered. The proud elm that had stood for 50 years now kindling. But as people emerged from the warehouse, Annie saw something else, neighbors helping neighbors, regardless of past judgments. Mrs. Pike organizing relief efforts with the same efficiency she'd once used for exclusion. Jake Morrison working alongside the men he'd drinking with to clear paths. "It's like the fire," Ruth said wonderingly. "But more so." Micah, wrapped in blankets but determined to help, looked at Annie. "The town won't be the same after this." "No," Annie agreed. "Thank God." The cleanup took days. The warehouse, having proved its worth, became the unofficial center of operations. Annie found herself coordinating efforts alongside the town council, her suggestions carrying weight they never had before. "We need better emergency protocols," she said at one meeting. "Designated shelters, supply stores, communication systems." "Agreed," Morrison said immediately. Others nodded. "Mrs. Pike raised her hand. "I propose we formalize Miss Calder's position, emergency coordinator or something similar. We've seen what happens when we work together instead of—" She gestured helplessly. "Whatever we were doing before." The vote was unanimous. That evening, Annie and Micah walked through the recovering town. His frostbite was healing, though Doc Hayworth had threatened dire consequences if he overdid things. They moved slowly, taking in the changes, both physical and spiritual. "I have something to tell you," Micah said as they reached the church square where the elm had stood. "In Texas, I did more than say goodbye. I sold the land Mary Catherine and I had owned, used the money to pay off her family's debts, but also—" He pulled a paper from his pocket. "I bought the Johnson plot, the one at the edge of town here, with the good well and the southern exposure." Annie stopped walking. "Micah." "I want to build a house," he said simply. "A real house, not rooms above a livery or in a warehouse. Something permanent, something ours." "Ours?" He turned to face her fully, there in the square where the whole town could see. "Marry me," Annie called her. "Let me build you a house with rooms for all the books you want to read. With space for the children we'll teach to think and question and be magnificent. Marry me, and let's make this place truly home." Annie looked around at the town that had tried to break her and instead had been transformed by her refusal to break. At the warehouse that had claimed her just as the drifter had warned. At the man who'd walked through a blizzard to return to her. "I told you once," she said, "that if you slept here, you'd never leave." "Best warning I ever received," Micah said, pulling her close. "Yes," Annie whispered against his chest. "Yes to all of it." When they kissed, there in the snowy square, Annie heard shutters opening, voices calling congratulations. Even Jake Morrison, passing with a load of lumber, managed a grudging nod. The storm had passed, leaving Dustwell scoured clean and ready for rebuilding. And at its heart stood a woman who'd refused to apologize for her magnificence, and a man who'd learned to stop drifting, both ready to build something new from the pieces of what had been. That night, safe in the warehouse room that had been her refuge and her proving ground, Annie wrote in her journal, "Home is not where they welcome you without question. Home is where you make them question their assumptions, where you stand firm until the ground itself shifts to accommodate you. Home is where you choose to stay and fight and love and build, especially when it would be easier to leave. Asterisk. Tomorrow we begin building a house, but today we've already built a home. Asterisk. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, like a benediction on a town reborn. Spring came to Dustwell like a tentative guest, unsure of its welcome after the harsh winter. The snow melted slowly, revealing both the storm's damage and the town's resilience, where the old elm had fallen. Someone had planted new saplings, 3 of them, young and hopeful against the scarred earth. Annie stood in what would be her sewing corner of the warehouse-turned-school, watching through the window as children played in the muddy yard. The temporary school had evolved into something neither temporary nor quite a school, more like a community center where learning happened alongside living. 17, Ruth announced, coming through the door with her ledger. 17 families have contributed to the building fund. Annie turned from the window, unable to hide her surprise. 17, including the Pikes. Ruth's smile was wry. Mrs. Pike insisted on being the largest donor, something about investing in the future. It had been 2 months since the storm, since Micah's proposal in the snow-covered square. 2 months of planning and working and slowly watching Dustwell transform itself. The town that had once tried to drive Annie out now seemed determined to keep her, and not just her, but the vision of community she represented. "Miss Annie!" Young James Pike burst through the door, papers clutched in his hand. "I finished the essay, the one about heroes." Annie took the offered pages, scanning his careful handwriting. Her throat tightened as she read his description of the lady who came into the storm for me when everyone else stayed safe inside. "It's wonderful, James," she said softly. "Your spelling has improved so much." "Aunt Helen's been helping me practice." He beamed. "She says education is the best investment a person can make." After he ran off, Ruth shook her head in amazement. Helen Pike, promoting education. What's next? Jake Morrison teaching temperance. "Don't jest," Annie warned. "He's been sober for 3 weeks now." They were still laughing when Micah appeared in the doorway, sawdust in his hair and satisfaction on his face. "Want to see?" he asked simply. Annie grabbed her shawl, following him through streets that showed new construction alongside old. The Johnson plot sat at the town's edge, where the land began its gentle rise toward the mountains. For weeks, Micah had been working there with a rotating crew of volunteers payment, many said, for what Annie had done during the storm. The house frame stood proud against the sky, 2 stories of honest timber and careful joinery. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was solid and well-proportioned, with windows facing all directions. "The main room will be here," Micah said, leading her through the skeletal structure. "Big enough for gatherings. A proper kitchen there. Ruth's been advising me on what you'll need. And upstairs," he helped her navigate the ladder to the 2nd floor. "A room for us, 2 smaller rooms for—" He paused, color rising in his cheeks. "For whatever we need them for." "Children," Annie said firmly. "For children, Micah, ours or others who need a place." His smile could have lit the whole territory. "Yes, for children." They stood together in what would be their bedroom, looking out through the unfinished window at Dustwell spread below. The town looked different from this slight elevation, smaller but also more cohesive, like a quilt finally settling into its pattern. "I never imagined this," Annie said quietly. "When I came here, running from one life, I never imagined I'd build another." "The warehouse warned you," Micah reminded her. "Said you'd never leave." "Best curse I ever fell under." She leaned into his warmth. "When do you think—" "June," he said. "We'll have it finished by June. Harlan's already planning the barn raising for May. Says the whole town will come." "The whole town at our home." Annie shook her head at the wonder of it. "Remember when they wouldn't sell me thread? Now they're arguing over who gets to make your wedding dress." Micah's voice held quiet pride. "You changed them, Annie." "We changed each other," she corrected. "That's how community works." They climbed down carefully, Annie accepting Micah's steady hand. As they walked back toward town, they passed the Weatherby house, where Sarah and little Thomas played in the yard. Both children waved enthusiastically. "Miss Annie Mister." "Micah?" Sarah called. "Mama says we can come to your school's spring program." The spring program had been Ruth's idea, a showcase of what the children had learned. Combined with a community celebration, what had started as a simple recitation evening had grown into something more elaborate, with music and readings and even a small play written by the older students. "We'll be glad to have you," Annie called back. At the warehouse, they found organized chaos. Miss Thornberry was teaching the youngest children a song while older students practiced their dramatic reading in another corner. Parents who once would have crossed streets to avoid the warehouse now moved through the space with comfortable familiarity. "Annie, perfect timing," Miss Thornberry said. "We need to discuss the ceremony order, and the refreshment committee wants to know about quantities." Ruth added, "And I've got 3 more men volunteering for the house construction." Harlan Pike interjected, having appeared with his usual impeccable timing. Annie looked at Micah, overwhelmed by the bustle of community around them. He squeezed her hand. "Divide and conquer," he suggested. "Always," she agreed. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The spring program grew more ambitious daily. The house rose steadily against the sky, and Annie found herself at the center of a web of planning that encompassed both. She taught during the days, oversaw program rehearsals in the afternoons, and spent evenings discussing house details with Micah and their ever-growing circle of advisors. It was Mrs. Pike who brought up the wedding. "You can't mean to have it at the courthouse," she said one evening, having stayed after a planning meeting. "Not after everything." "We haven't really thought," Annie began. "Well, you should. The whole town will want to witness it." Mrs. Pike's voice brooked no argument. "The church, of course. Reverend Blackwood has already mentioned he'd be honored." "Mrs. Pike," Annie said carefully. "6 months ago you wanted me run out of town." The older woman's face softened in a way Annie had rarely seen. "6 months ago I was a different person, smaller, meaner, afraid." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not saying I'm perfect now, but I'm trying. And part of trying is making sure you have the wedding this town owes you." "Helen." It was the first time Annie had used her given name. "Thank you." Mrs. Pike cleared her throat briskly. "Yes, well, we'll need to coordinate with the house completion. A June wedding, after the school program, but before the worst heat." Annie let her plan, hiding a smile. This was how Dustwell healed, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of inclusion. Former enemies becoming invested in each other's happiness. The spring program arrived with mayflowers and nervous energy. The warehouse had been transformed with garlands and paper decorations made by the students. Benches borrowed from the church created an amphitheater facing the makeshift stage. Annie stood at the side, watching her students prepare. Bobby Daniels, who'd once declared numbers devil's work, now proudly clutched his arithmetic demonstration. James Pike adjusted his costume for the play he was portraying a frontier teacher, a role he'd specifically requested. Nervous, Micah appeared at her elbow, handsome in his best shirt. "Terrified," Annie admitted. "What if—" "They'll be magnificent," he interrupted, "just like their teacher." The warehouse filled with families. More than Annie had dared hope. She saw familiar faces and unfamiliar ones. People drawn by curiosity or community, or both. Even Jake Morrison was there, sober and scrubbed, helping elderly Mrs. Chen to a seat. The program began with the youngest children singing, their voices sweet and only occasionally off-key. Then came recitations, arithmetic demonstrations, and readings that showcased how far the students had come. Parents who'd been skeptical of Annie's methods watched their children perform with growing amazement. The play was the centerpiece, a simple story about a frontier town learning to welcome strangers, written collectively by the older students with suspicious parallels to recent events. James Pike delivered his lines about the importance of education with such passion that his aunt wiped away tears. But it was Sarah Weatherby who stole the show. The girl whose life Annie and Micah had saved now stood before the crowd and recited an original poem about courage. Courage isn't loud or grand. It's reaching out a helping hand. It's standing up when others fall. It's making room for one and all. Asterisk. Annie felt Micah's hand find hers as Sarah continued, her young voice carrying through the warehouse with startling clarity. The poem was simple, even childish in places, but its sincerity struck deep. When the program ended, the applause was thunderous. Parents surrounded their children, praise flowing freely. Annie found herself pulled into conversation after conversation, accepting thanks and congratulations until her face ached from smiling. "Miss Calder," Councilman Morrison approached during the refreshment hour. "A word." Annie tensed, but his expression was thoughtful rather than antagonistic. "The council met yesterday. He said, we voted to fund a proper school building, not just temporary space, a real school, with proper classrooms and supplies." He paused. "We also voted to offer you the position of head teacher, official, salaried, permanent." Annie's breath caught. "Mr. Morrison." "You've earned it," he said simply. "The town needs you. We're just finally admitting it officially." Later, as families departed and cleanup began, Annie stood in the emptying warehouse that had been her first home in Dustwell. So much had changed since that cold December night when Micah had knocked on her door with his warning. "Regrets?" Micah asked, joining her. "Never." She leaned into him. "Though I'll miss this place when we move to the house." "It'll still be here, still be part of the school." He wrapped an arm around her. "Places don't lose their importance just because we move beyond them." Ruth approached with Emma, both glowing from the evening's success. "Annie, the women want to know about wedding plans. They're threatening to form a committee." "Heaven help us," Micah muttered, but he was smiling. "Let them," Annie said. "This town does committees well." As they locked up the warehouse, Annie touched the doorframe, a small gesture of gratitude to the space that had sheltered her when nowhere else would. Tomorrow would bring more planning, more building, more careful construction of community. But tonight, walking through streets that no longer felt hostile, surrounded by people who'd learned to see her truly, Annie Calder felt the deep satisfaction of belonging earned rather than granted. "No regrets?" Micah asked again as they reached the corner where they'd part him to Harlan's, her to the warehouse for a few more weeks. "Only one," Annie said, stretching up to kiss him. "That we didn't start building sooner." His laughter followed her home, warm as spring promise, steady as the frame of their rising house, sure as the knowledge that some storms cleared the way for stronger growth. The warehouse room welcomed her back. But it felt different now, not a refuge, but a launching point. Not an ending, but the beginning of everything that mattered. June arrived, dressed in wildflowers and possibilities. The house on the hill stood complete, its fresh-painted walls gleaming white in the morning sun. Annie walked through the rooms one last time before the wedding, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors that still smelled of sawdust and promise. "Having second thoughts?" Ruth asked from the doorway. Arms full of wedding flowers, wild roses, and prairie blooms that Helen Pike's committee had spent dawn gathering. "About the wedding, never." Annie smoothed her hands over the simple white dress misses. Chen had sewn with meticulous care. "About leaving the warehouse? Perhaps a little." "It served its purpose," Ruth said gently. "Gave you shelter when you needed it. Now you're giving shelter to others." It was true. The warehouse had evolved beyond recognition, with plans for the new school building already drawn up. 3 more teachers had been hired, and families were moving to Dustwell specifically for the educational opportunities, something that would have been laughable just 6 months ago. "Miss Annie?" Emma burst in, ribbon-bedecked and glowing. "Mama, everyone's at the church, even Mr. Jake Morrison, and he's wearing a proper suit." Annie and Ruth exchanged glances. Jake's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising, from bitter drunk to one of the school's most dedicated supporters, teaching carpentry to the older boys with gruff kindness. "Then we'd better not keep them waiting," Annie said. The walk to the church felt both eternal and instant. Main Street had been decorated with bunting and flowers, and it seemed every soul in Dustwell had turned out to line the route. Children from the school threw flower petals, their faces bright with excitement. "Look at that," Ruth murmured. "The woman they tried to run out of town, now getting a hero's welcome." Not a hero, Annie corrected. Just stubborn. In Dustwell, that might be the same thing. The church doors stood open, organ music spilling into the street. Annie paused at the threshold, suddenly overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here from rejection in Philadelphia to acceptance in this unlikely place. Then she saw Micah. He stood at the altar in his best black suit, the one he'd worn to the winter social that had changed everything. But now he wore it with easy confidence. No longer armor against judgment, but simply the clothes of a man who knew where he belonged. His gray eyes found hers across the crowded church, and the smile that spread across his face made her knees weak. Harlan Pike, serving as best man, whispered something that made Micah chuckle. Miss Thornberry, Annie's chosen attendant, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Reverend Blackwood beamed from his position, clearly delighted to be presiding over a union that represented so much healing for his community. The walk down the aisle felt like floating. Annie saw faces that had become dear the Weatherby family. Little Thomas waving enthusiastically. Mr. Chen and his family, sitting proudly in a middle pew where once they might have been relegated to the back. Bobby Daniels, grinning gap-toothed and genuine. Even Mrs. Pike sat in the front row, having appointed herself chief wedding organizer with the same fervor she'd once applied to exclusion. She nodded approvingly at Annie's appearance, high praise indeed. But it was Micah's face that held Annie's attention as she reached the altar. The drifter who'd warned her about staying, who'd himself been caught by the same spell. Dearly beloved, Reverend Blackwood began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church. We gather today to witness something precious, not just a union of two people, but a testament to the power of persistence, acceptance, and love. The ceremony itself was simple. They'd written their own vows, despite some raised eyebrows from traditionalists. Micah went first, his rough voice steady. Annie called her. You walked into my life with books and determination and a refusal to be anything less than yourself. You made me want to stop drifting, to build something permanent, to be the man who deserved you. I promised to stand beside you, not in front, not behind, but beside for all the days of our lives. I promised to support your magnificent mind, to defend your right to speak truth, and to love you exactly as you are, forever. Annie had to blink back tears before she could speak. Micah Hale, you appeared at my door with warnings that became promises. You showed me that strength could be gentle, that broken things could be rebuilt stronger. That home wasn't about being welcomed, but about choosing to stay. I promised to build our life with the same determination I brought to this town. I promised to fill our home with books and questions and children who know they're loved for who they are. I promised to love you through every storm and every season, forever. The rings, Reverend Blackwood prompted. James Pike stepped forward importantly, carrying the simple gold bands on a pillow his aunt had embroidered. The boy who'd once been lost in a storm now served as ring-bearer for the woman who'd saved him. As Micah slipped the ring onto Annie's finger, she remembered that first night, his scarred hands warming by her stove, the careful way he'd held her father's book. Now those same hands held hers with perfect certainty. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Blackwood declared, Mr. Hale, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was sweet and sure, a promise sealed before the whole town. The church erupted in cheers and applause that would have scandalized proper society but felt exactly right for Dustwell. They walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, pelted with rice and good wishes. Outside, tables had been set up in the square where the old elm had stood, laden with food contributed by every family in town. Musicians tuned their instruments on a makeshift platform, and children were already racing between the tables in their Sunday best. No grand honeymoon trip, Mrs.? Pike asked during the reception, watching Annie and Micah greet their guests. We thought about it, Annie admitted. But honestly, where would we rather be than here? Mrs. Pike's smile was knowing. That warehouse did warn you. The celebration lasted well into the evening. There were toasts, some eloquent, some stumbling, all heartfelt. Miss Thornberry spoke about courage in the face of opposition. Harlan praised Micah's steadiness and Annie's fire. Even Jake Morrison stood to say a few words about second chances and the grace of forgiveness. But it was Ruth who captured the moment best. They say home is where the heart is, but I think it's where you fight to make your heart welcome. Annie and Micah didn't just find a home here, they carved it out of stubbornness and hope. They made us all better for it. As twilight fell, Annie and Micah finally escaped to their new house on the hill. The furniture was sparse, they'd add to it over time, but wildflowers filled every room, and friends had stocked the pantry. They stood on the porch, looking down at Dustwell's lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dark. Music and laughter still drifted from the square, the sound of a community celebrating itself as much as the newlyweds. "Any regrets?" Micah asked, echoing his question from months before. "Only that I can't see what's coming next," Annie said, leaning into his embrace. "I can tell you some of it," he said. "Tomorrow, you'll wake up in our bed in our house. You'll make coffee in our kitchen. Maybe read one of your books by our window. In the fall, you'll start teaching in the new school building. Children will come to learn not just arithmetic, but how to think, how to question, how to be magnificent. And you? I'll be at the livery during the day, building furniture in the evenings, making cradles, perhaps, for when we need them." His hand splayed protective over her stomach, though there was no need yet, just hope. "And every night, I'll come home to you." "That sounds like a good life," Annie said softly. "The best." They stayed on the porch as full dark fell, watching their town settle into sleep. In the morning, there would be thank you notes to write, a new household to organize, a life to build day by day. But tonight, they simply stood together. Two people who'd found home not in a place, but in the choice to stay and fight for it. A year later, when young couple arrived in Dustwell seeking rooms, Annie was the one who showed them the warehouse space, renovated now but still affordable for those needing a fresh start. "It's not much," the woman said uncertainly, taking in the simple room. "It's enough," Annie said, remembering her own first night. "More than enough, if you let it be." The man frowned. "We heard this town could be unwelcoming to outsiders." Annie smiled, thinking of all the ways that had been true, all the ways it had changed. Every town has its challenges, but Dustwell has learned something important, that being different isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. "Still," the woman said, "such a small place. What if we can't leave if it doesn't work out?" Annie exchanged glances with Micah, who'd come to help with the tour. He grinned, that same knowing smile from their first meeting. "Oh," Annie said, her hand finding Micah's, her other hand resting on the gentle swell that promised new life by harvest time. "If you sleep here, you'll never leave." The couple looked alarmed, but Annie laughed full and free and joyous. "And that," she added, looking around the warehouse that had sheltered her, the town that had challenged and finally claimed her, the man who'd warned her true, "is the very best thing that could happen to you." The warehouse walls seemed to hum with agreement, ready to shelter new dreams, new fights, new possibilities. And in a house on the hill, a cradle waited to be filled, built by loving hands that had learned the value of staying put. Dustwell wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was home fought for, earned, chosen, and for Annie Calder Hale, who'd once run from a life too small for her spirit. That was exactly where she wanted to be. After all, some warnings were really invitations in disguise, and some roots, once planted in unlikely soil, grew deeper and stronger than anyone could have imagined. The drifter had warned true, "If you sleep here, you'll never leave." And thank God for that. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Annie and Micah's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I love connecting with listeners from all over the world and hearing your thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this tale of love and belonging in the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And if you really want to help more people discover these stories, please hit the hype button. It makes a huge difference in reaching new listeners who love Western romance as much as we do. Until next time, partners.